So welcome. Thanks everybody for joining us again for the second and last lecture by Dr. Michael Veale. Today is a day on tracking, and that will be very interesting, and it will be fun to join us afterwards for informally in the restaurant next door for exchanges. The speaker has a bit of time before the plane takes off. And don't forget that tomorrow and after tomorrow we continue with the same series on data protection and concluding the cycle of 3 series. But the speaker, Stefano Rossetti from None of Your Business, NOYB, is only talking on Zoom because he has no time between meetings to travel and be safely here for 11 o'clock. So tomorrow will be from our offices. Michael, thank you, and please.
Thanks, everyone. So today I want to talk about online tracking and some of the legal aspects around it as well. Just like before, please feel free to put your hand up and we can take diversions and if you need anything clarifying, we can talk about that. Online tracking has been a pretty important part of the web and also other technologies like apps and other parts of consumer and user devices. Since fairly soon after the web was created. But for a very long time it went without significant scrutiny. This is partly because the mechanisms of monetizing the internet and creating the digital economy that we have today, it was unclear what trajectory that would take. And certainly countries, states, regulators didn't really want to step on the direction of this new promising technology. As a result, we saw a lot of practices that we now can look back on and think probably should have been directed in a different way earlier on, went unscrutinized at that earlier stage. So I think this is one of the dynamics that we see constantly throughout the history of the web, and I wanted to track it a bit back over time. It's almost tracking the trackers. This isn't to say that academics and researchers have not long been interested in the dynamics of tracking, but one thing that's quite unusual about this space is that there is, in a way, quite a black box as to how a lot of the advertising industry, even though it is very big and very globally influential, actually functions technically. It's often quite arcane, and researchers find themselves in an unusual position. They find themselves outside this box trying to study the external features to work out what's happening inside, when really these are practices that are also being carried out by companies and organizations around the world. So perhaps it contrasts quite nicely with the work here at CERN and in general in high energy physics, where we're, not me personally, but where people here are trying to find out things that no human really knows for sure, or to falsify or understand better hypotheses that have been proposed. In the world of the studies of ad tech, we're trying to find out what other humans are doing behind closed doors and how they're using and configuring technologies. But there are broader questions that are important, and academic researchers have been playing a very key role in looking at, about the effect and the impact of these technologies on wider society. And those have not been explored heavily by industry, and it has been up to researchers and scientists of different colors and shades to help shed light on this. So lots of complex interacting systems here. We can start, this vibrates, that's strange. We can start by going back a little bit in time for a history of web tracking. I'm sure that people in the room are skilled on this, not everybody. I don't want to assume any knowledge, so please bear with me if I kind of bring everybody up, hopefully, to speed. This is the same kind of way I do for my law students as well. When the web was created in the early 90s, somewhere near here, it was stateless, and that meant it had no memory of its visitors, and the best metaphor for that is like a bulletin board. A bulletin board doesn't remember who walked past and looked at it, it just shows the same information regardless of user or context. This had a lot of advantages because of terms of openness and accessibility, but also had a lot of disadvantages it was very difficult, for example, to log into websites because that login might have to be encoded inside the URL, which would make it quite fundamentally insecure and tricky to manage as a piece of secret technology, to try and manage secrets in that context. It also made it hard to display things that were kind of customized for the user. So towards the end of the 90s particularly, we saw a growth in research, and some of you may have been involved in that, in things like adaptive hypermedia, where people started to say, well, could these hypermedia technologies of linked documents and linked resources adapt better to the user and the viewer and be more convenient? It linked to general ideas of personalization in information retrieval. As the information online and just generally computerized grew, it became more difficult for people to manage and navigate manually. And towards all of these ends, there were efforts to try and make the web remember people better. And one of the methods that has become effectively the norm today is through the cookie. This was first laid out as a state management proposal, and it was related to the work on Netscape Navigator at this time, I believe. And this was again a time where web standards were still quite early, and browsers and web standards were sort of on the same page and working maybe much more collegially, except perhaps for the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who famously tried to seize intellectual property and therefore killing one of the first most successful web browsers, Mosaic. So in this case, cookies were solving this problem, and effectively cookies we can just think of as text placed on your browser by a server, and that server can look at it later. That's the most simple definition of what this is, so that you go to a website and you are storing some information that website can request, and it could tailor the information it's giving you or the computation it's carrying out in your browser based on that request. And it's a very simple piece of technology. It has things like an expiration date, a path and a domain, and other information as well, but it's very, very small and simple and text-based. So cookies are not a very scary technology for those of you who don't know them, but they are one that is very web-focused, so it doesn't make so much sense of talking about cookies and things like apps and so on unless those apps are web-based, although some people sometimes do. Now, the challenge with cookies, and it was something that was identified quite early on, is that cookies worked pretty well when you were just querying a website and all that information came from the same server, but web page complexity was quickly growing. In the early days of the web, if you went to a web page and you went to a URL, you could generally expect that everything you were seeing was coming from the same server, but that quickly changed, and people started to link to resources, images, hot linking to other servers and other resources, embedding content, and indeed Netscape Navigator in 1996 introduced the iframe, which allowed two web pages to be rendered in a single browsing window. And this raised an interesting question, because if you had this idea that websites could leave cookies on your browser, then at this stage you had a question about which website could access the cookies that were in your browser. Could every website access every cookie, or would there be a series of restrictions? Now, we know from general studies of regulation of technology that some people say the phrase code is law. Now, that's not really true, but certainly rules can be regulated through information policy. So we have the idea of what a browser does and the regulations a browser puts on, so what is permitted or not permitted to be done, have a structuring effect upon the world, and this is one of the early structures. Because web browsers came up with a policy for this, and it was called the same origin policy. The idea here, and this is still present today, although it's been a bit perverted, as we'll see, cookies are only accessible by servers that share certain features with the server that laid the cookie. In particular, the domain. So there are some other features as well. The protocol matters, for example. But, for example, I'm at University College London, and someone visiting ucl.ac.uk should not expect that ucl.ac.uk should be able to read King's College London kcl.ac.uk laid cookies. And if they could, it would be a pretty big security breach, because you might have a session identifier from a login session stored in one of them, and that session identifier is actually a very precious thing, because it would allow you to spoof a login. So the kind of remember me when you've logged into a website, I could reuse that and log in, particularly if I had the same IP address as with the one you're coming from, and then I could log in without knowing your password, at least for a period of time. So the same origin policy has valid security concerns, but it also has important privacy concerns, because otherwise you're already carrying around your web history with you and making it available to every website you go to. Unfortunately, that's kind of what happened. So the same origin policy didn't really fix the web and web tracking for very long. So websites first started to call lots of different servers, and not just for the sake of convenience or providing different resources from different locations as a sort of handy thing to have, like a portal or something like this. Website would instruct your computer to query many, many domains, and many of those were increasingly tied up with aspects of the digital economy. So this became the way in which people would query trackers and other websites and other servers. In doing so, if you had a website that was embedding lots of different trackers, like trackerA.com, trackerB.com, trackerC.com, when I went to news.com, if I go to news.com, well, it gives tracker A, tracker B, tracker C a chance to read the cookies that they've laid on my device from a previous time. And they wouldn't be able to read the cookies directly laid by news.com, but they could read their own cookies, and they could also see that I was visiting news.com at that time. So they could establish a web history of people based on cookie identifiers for when you browse multiple websites. So if trackerA.com was prevalent on 10 different websites I'd visited, they would be able to see a list of those things, because they would be reading their cookie every single time, and they could pass that on to their server and build a profile of me and say the person who carries this cookie identifier has visited at least these past 10 websites. But this required cookies to be present very widely across the web. And because of the web, it has sort of decentralized aspects, and not everybody is using the same code, and it's very difficult to go and get everything installed in the same way on every single website. The same origin policy would still seem fairly protective from this, because you'd only have the ability to track across the websites in which that tracker was enabled. But as we went into the 90s and early 2000s, we saw a greater centralization of the internet economy, and particularly companies like Google, who then bought DoubleClick, which was a large advertising company in the early 2000s. We started to see that those trackers became more prevalent across the internet. So in a study by Karaja et al., Google calls home with about unique identifiers, so not even all the times Google calls home, but just when they call home with unique identifiers, for about 28% of all web page loads, and Facebook does for 15%. Now, these numbers might seem low, but you also have to remember that people are often querying websites on, say, government pages, or banking websites, or CERN, or something like this. Well, hopefully CERN isn't embedding Google Analytics everywhere. But they probably are somewhere on the website, because many organizations accidentally do, for reasons we'll talk about in a second. And so you can see its proportion is very high in some sectors rather than others. Now, the interesting part of this is this proportion sort of became so high for a variety of reasons. Companies would offer perks to websites that would embed their trackers. They might embed analytics. They might have they've also created a bit of an expectation or industry that, say, research projects should measure the page hits and give reporting information about how many people are visiting their page as a public engagement outreach, and they can provide that service for free to those organizations, so those organizations end up putting it on. That means that those kind of functionalities get embedded in web templates, which Google and Facebook often have a role and teams in editing and creating, or at least informing, and people who just roll out those web templates are going to find themselves calling code from these companies. And similarly, we also find that website builders, which is Wix.com or previously something like AngelFire or something like this, they would be embedding almost by default, or WordPress, almost by default, the set of Google Analytics, and people would just turn them on without really thinking. It just became a sort of muscle memory for what you do when you build something on the internet. And this kind of set of practices was designed to spread these trackers around the web, but it's still not everywhere. These trackers are still not absolutely everywhere. And therefore, we get to a world where it's of cookie syncing, syncing with a Y, not with an I. Cookie syncing is a method that is used for trackers to collaborate with each other, and there are a few different approaches to this. But effectively, it's designed to break the same origin policy. The same origin policy is meant to help to split up and to firewall away tracker A from tracker B on a website, so they can't read each other's cookies. But what often will happen is that there will be a chain of requests in JavaScript. So, for example, maybe I could write it down on the whiteboard, but I don't think I need to. For example, if your website initially queries tracker A and tracker B and they can get a chance to read their own cookies and read their identifiers, well, tracker A could have a deal with tracker B. And they say, well, actually, our tracker A code on your website will call a URL. It will call from that website trackera.com/ then something like question mark tracker B ID equals this. So tracker B I think I've got them the wrong way around, sorry, but tracker B knows the ID that it's just read from your cookie. It wants to pass that ID onto tracker A. So it does so by triggering that identifier in a cookie to be passed within a URL to tracker A's server. And so tracker A can immediately see that and say, well, I've got a URL. The URL contains the tracker ID from tracker B. I can read my cookies from tracker A on that website, so I know the cookie ID of tracker A, and suddenly I have them in the same place. So tracker A then has tracker A and tracker B cookies from that person. And what they can do is they can then share data behind the scenes. So they can then say, well, every few months or every week or automatically every day, we have a direct server-to-server transfer of information from tracker A to tracker B, where we do some set intersection maybe, and we share web history, and therefore we accumulate a better and a richer variety of information about where that user has been, because tracker A and tracker B no longer are firewalled and distinct in practice. Does that make sense to people? It's a bit, yeah, great. I did used to have a slide for it, but I just clearly forgot to put it on, I think I just realized, which had the URLs on. So here we see a very interesting paper by Bashir and Wilson at Northwestern, and Northeastern. I think they're at Northwestern. I always forget. It's Chicago and Boston. It's very, very far away. Bashir and Wilson have a very interesting study, and they realize that we actually have no way to identify how much of this goes on. We can identify cookie syncing in the wild because we can find evidence that that calling of other servers is happening. So you can investigate the code that runs on browsers. You can look at the JavaScript and say, here is an example of cookie syncing practices. And indeed, cookie syncing is often built into the advertising tech industry. So there are opportunities to do that according to the rules of the game. But what happens on top of this is we don't really know how much of the server-to-server transfers are happening between which organizations. So they model this, and it's a very interesting paper as a result. And through their modeling, they indicate that 53 firms observe more than 91% of users' browser behavior. And that's on quite conservative estimates of server-to-server transfer. So you can see very clearly that while it looks like there are many trackers, and they might all have a bit of the elephant, under what we see from empirical information in the world, plus some quite conservative assumptions, we can see tracking as really the case of many firms, because these are, there's not a small number of organizations, and they can be dealt with in many different ways, gather data which effectively amounts to a larger portion of users' web history. So this is a pretty worrying situation, and I think it shows the undermining of this same origin policy and how it's quite difficult to restrict this. Now, of course, there are attempts to limit cookie syncing, and web browsers try and restrict the kind of calls that can be made in a browser. But when you've got quite open-ended ways to query networks, there are only so many things you can do to stop that, as long as you allow this kind of initial tracking to take place. So this is the sort of way tracking developed. We also saw a range of other interesting technologies building on this. The so-called super cookies, which really is a description for a cookie that tries to reestablish itself when it's deleted. And it can do that through a variety of means. It might do that through cookie syncing from another provider. So if tracker A's cookies get deleted, but tracker B's cookies are still there, well, if tracker A has the cookie syncing and it realizes its cookie isn't present on the device from that user, then it can effectively reestablish the same identifier it had previously. So therefore, cleaning your cookies becomes less effective at stopping this tracking. And we also find it happening through web fingerprinting. So web fingerprinting is a technology which tries to use the unique features of your network connection, your web browser, your operating system, or your computer setup in order to profile you as you go around the internet. And it will do quite elaborate things. So for example, one classic technology of web fingerprinting is to try and look at the fonts you have installed on your device. It will at some point in the page, often at a hidden point in the page, it'll have a very long list of fonts, including odd custom ones that it knows exist in the world. And it will rapidly query the font. It'll put a character in a box, and it will rapidly change the font of that character. Change. And if your computer has that font installed, it would expect that the box would resize to the correct dimensions of the font that you have installed. And if you don't have it installed, it's going to default to something like Arial or Courier or something like this. So by doing that, by running through all those fonts, just saying, like, is your custom font working, then you can effectively have one additional point, which is pretty rich, on a user's device. So if you have a weird custom font installed that a lot of users don't, it will immediately single you out, particularly in relation to your browser version, your operating system, and your IP address altogether. It becomes very difficult to have a homogeneous fingerprint on the internet without both heavily restricting web functionality and also by obfuscating or hiding your network information within the crowd. So it is possible to avoid fingerprinting. If you use a heavily locked down browser that tries to look the same to everybody, you run it through a VPN or maybe over Tor or something like this. Tor is designed to function in this way, for example, and it will block using custom fonts, and it will block a lot of other things. Then you can reduce the space of fingerprinting, and there are also fingerprinting countermeasures, but you can see it's always hard to appear less unique, especially in a customizable world. And fingerprinting is also a way in which people re-establish cookies. So you can try and fingerprint users in order to re-establish cookies. There's also technologies to try and establish cookies or tracking profiles across devices by understanding IP addresses being used at similar times to similar services in the same home to make family profiles and other network level information. So really, I don't want to provide an exhaustive list of this, but you can see it's a very creative set of tools that are used across the web and other technologies in order to establish this. Does anyone have any questions about web fingerprinting to begin with, web cookies or so on? No. So apps are a different thing yet. While some apps, and by the word apps, I mean applications as coined by Google and Apple. We're talking about software that you download through an application store on a mobile device, typically. Usually this informal term apps. Well, some apps do use web technologies. Many of them are using other proprietary or compiled code bases. And these technologies don't need to rely on cookies because they are limited only by the operating system in what they can track and what they can call. They can make any network request they like. So a recent study indicated that there are about 2,000 separate advertising tracking services and apps, and they can be grouped by ownership into approximately 292 parent organizations. So we find that we have plenty of app tracking systems here, and that's in Android. iPhones are not necessarily more private. They are actually just harder to study. It is much harder because of the proprietary nature of iOS, in order to simulate and run these technologies. So my colleagues at the University of Oxford, who do large-scale studies on the Android ecosystem, they spin up hundreds of virtual machines inside a large computing cluster they have, and they download application packages and they try and test them in various ways. They might have an automated system or a machine vision system trying to kind of click through and do some rudimentary things on the app in order to get a bit further into it so that you might trigger some tracking code that might work, and then you do some network monitoring. There's some kind of there's some software analysis you can do as well at this point. So there's a lot going on that you can try in order to study applications. Although it's also made harder by Android in recent years. Stock Android tries to do things like block VPNs that try and do package sniffing on devices. Some colleagues around the world have been working on technologies that are sort of more crowdsourced, so you could have people run through a VPN on their device and that data can go to researchers for analysis, so you get some sort of real-world studies of apps. Lots of ways to do this, but it's harder on iOS, so it makes it look like in the research field that Google is very bad and iOS is very good, but really, as work from Konrad Kollnig at the University of Oxford has been pointing out, iPhones are not necessarily better at this from what we know and what we can study about them. We also find that the trackers are numbers in an absolute term is much higher than on the web. So we're talking about nearly 90% of apps containing a Google tracker, over 40% by Facebook, and a longer tail by other organizations, Verizon, Microsoft, and so on. And we also find that apps have a lot of trackers in a single one. So larger portions, about 25% of different apps in certain categories, have more than 10 tracking companies represented in them. So you find your data is going to many places, and there's no need for that cookie syncing. Now, you find the operating system can be involved in restricting this. In particular, Apple recently, in recent years, has put something in place called App Tracking Transparency. And some people who have iPhones may have been asked, do you want this app to track you and share your identifiers? What that means is the operating system is trying to prevent the app from accessing an identifier that would allow them to understand something about other apps installed in that device. So it's a bit like cross-site tracking, but you can think of it as sort of cross-app tracking, and it would let that information be joined together and say, this user of the app is the same as other users of the app. But remember, yes, that might be a little bit of a blow, but you also have things like IP addresses, which can be used to probabilistically link people together when these queries come in. And so they're not particularly effective. They're not the only way in which you can do that kind of linkage. So we find this is there. Now, some people might think that, what have I got to hide? I'm just using my phone in very inane ways. And that's fair. Like some people say, I don't mind being tracked. Advertising could be useful for me or interesting for me. We'll get to that point about what exactly is going on here, but I want to just point out a few things first. That app tracking is used for singling people out, individuating people from the crowd. And that is also the technology and the aim of many state surveillance, both from law enforcement and from intelligence agencies, signals intelligence agencies. So looking first at law enforcement agencies, we can see in the United States many, many agencies and parts and departments of the United States use app tracking data as a way of getting location data about individuals without issuing a warrant. This is very commonly used by anyone for the US military, Customs and Border Protection, the Secret Service, and Homeland Security, among others. And they purchase data from often companies in the ad stack or companies that have bought data from other companies in the ad stack and make a whole business out of reselling it to public entities. So a tracker called Xmode is a common location tracker. In this space, location data is very valuable for these organizations, as you might imagine. They have trackers in very popular Quran and prayer time apps, as well as a Craigslist searching app, a spirit level app, like lots of the inane long tail of apps that people find when they're quickly trying to download something for complete utility purposes. And it might have some ads. They don't really care. Like, I just need to do it once. I need to get a spirit level thing done, and then I'm done. Like I didn't have a spirit level. I've lost it, or something like that. And they also use bid stream data. We talk about what this is in a minute. It's about real-time bidding, and that's sort of from the broader ad tech stack. And so they are drawing on data from a lot of these organizations. Now, it might not always be the best or highest quality data, although I will note that during the pandemic, Xmode claimed that its data would be very useful for contact tracing. Now, I think this is probably just bravado and total nonsense. But you can see that they're claiming they have data which, according to them, would have such precision as to indicate when two individuals have been near each other in order to meaningfully assess exposure to each other. Now, I think that is probably complete bullshit, but it is indicative of the kind of claims that these companies make about their location data. More recently in the United States, this has hit the news a little bit more, because after the repeal of Roe and Wade in the Dobbs decision, it has triggered first a lot of anti-abortion laws that were criminalizing abortion already present on state statute books to sort of re-kick in. And those in turn triggered the ability for law enforcement to use data to start prosecutions. And the prosecutions of both individuals seeking abortions, but also clinicians and so on providing them. And so there have been many vendors found selling data that can specifically be used to locate women who have visited abortion clinics. And this has been reported on heavily by Joseph Cox, who writes for Vice Motherboard. And it's a very interesting series of articles about this. And so this debate has kicked off a bit more, and there have been efforts to try and regulate location data in the United States, which the context of the US is the US doesn't have a federal data protection bill or legislation. It's one of the only kind of major countries in the world that doesn't have anything like that. So a lot of this stuff goes very unregulated. But it can only regulate in a piecemeal way politically. And so discussions about let's regulate facial recognition or let's regulate location data, whereas this data is this kind of issue is a lot richer and broader and therefore becomes more difficult to see in that context. Moving on to intelligence agencies, we see that this is not just used by law enforcement, but can go a lot deeper. Like I said, the idea of cookies in the ad tech stack is to single people out and to create a trail about them that's unique to them. This has become very useful for intelligence agencies, particularly as we have a growth in encrypted HTTP. So post the Snowden revelations, and due to especially the work of the late Peter Eckersley at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, creating Let's Encrypt, which probably people in the room have used, I imagine, which provides free certificates for HTTPS and TLS and so on encryption to websites that they can use in order to limit certain eavesdropping attacks. These piggybacking on any kind of technology that allows you to locate someone over time and work out what they might be doing is very useful. So the NSA and GCHQ have utilized the uniquely identifying pref cookies that Google lays as part of their double-click system, and they've then used this as a way to identify and sort of locate over time computers that can be remotely hacked or exploited. And double-click cookies as well have been used by NSA in order to try and re-identify Tor browser users who make the mistake of logging in to a service, or make the mistake of having lower cookie settings, or just general features that are effectively easier to. Before Tor had put in countermeasures against this, there's a kind of an arms race about online tracking and then tracking detection, which also plays out on dark web technologies just like it does in normal technologies. And particularly, this is not people using, I think, onion sites as much as people using just normal clear websites. Belgacom, now called Proximus, is one of the major telecoms companies in Belgium, and the good money is on the fact that Belgacom is likely still totally compromised by US, UK, and Canadian intelligence. It was famously in the Belgacom hack, but Belgacom never really managed to clear their systems of this very advanced hack. It is in a very strategic place, and at least in my experience, people will generally assert they think Belgacom is still compromised. This hack was achieved in part by the system called Mutant Broth, which effectively stored and tracked from the internet buffer, the internet interception system, where fiber cables and so on would be redirected, doubled, and buffered for a period of time, and have cookies extracted from them, among other analyses. These would allow effectively profiles to be made of individuals who could be manually targeted for, say, human exploitation in order to get usernames and passwords and phishing attacks and so on. And so build a pattern of people's daily routines using technologies so that you could effectively profile them and then undertake these manual attacks where you might need to exploit human weakness in a system more effectively. And so you can see here has a list of sort of all the cookie types and domains that are in the Mutant Broth system as leaked in the Snowden leaks. So these are, while these might not be like as flashy as establishing like coastline interception of fiber optic cables at gigantic cost, duplicating the content of them and buffering them for a few days at a time so they can be searched through, these technologies are piggybacked on by intelligence. And as other things become encrypted, if we're not actually stopping this individuation coming, then it will make it worse, I would imagine, for these purposes. But even when we think of something just within the advertising ecosystem, these technologies are pretty bad. So I don't know if anyone's ever seen this before. Oh, hang on. Sorry, it's not even going to work because I set the wrong setting when I exported the PDF. Okay, I'll have to explain it. You go to a website and you see this advertising box. And what it'll be is it'll be empty for a moment. It'll be grey for a small moment after the web page loads. And then, within a couple of seconds or within half a second, it might populate with an ad. But it often will happen after the rest of the web page loads. You'll sort of see a moment where it's gray and then a moment where an ad is added on later on. You might not see this, of course, if you have ad blockers or so on installed. But it's that delay. And people put down that delay in their mind often, in my experience, to them thinking their web browsing is quite slow. Or their internet connection is slow. But it's not actually because of that. It's because of a very complicated system called real-time bidding, where there is an auction running for your eyeballs at the moment that you are clicking on that website. When you request a page like a news page, you will get that page back, and then that page simultaneously will send to a sort of agent of theirs in the auction economy a bid request saying, we want to have bids for this viewer on this website. And that bid request will be full of information about that user. It might contain all the cookie IDs that are available to that website and its series of trackers. It will contain information about if you've logged in. It might contain that kind of information about the page you're on, the category of the page, as much as they know. There are lots of categories they can use. And that cookie data goes directly from your browser sometimes to this platform. At that point, you get this bid request that's made. And there's a transmission of this bid request to hundreds of would-be bidders. So it's at this point, the personal data about your browsing, your cookie identifiers and so on, the fact that you have visited a newspaper website gets transmitted by design to just hundreds of potential people, agents acting for many advertisers. And they will hold on to this data as well, and they will look through it, and they will make decisions on that basis. Those, in turn, will enrich this data. So they'll say, I have this cookie ID. I have automatic API connections to data brokers. I will query those data brokers with this cookie ID, and they will come back about, well, this is John Smith. John Smith likes these kind of holidays, has probably this kind of income, this kind of demographic, lives here, sometimes lives here. Here's a LinkedIn profile with metadata from that, or here's a embedding which you can use for your system. There's a lot of ways this really works. But effectively, this is a process which happens also very quickly. From that, there are bids that are made. Lots of them try and auction and place different prices. But there will be a winning bid, often for various sort of economic theory reasons. It's the second highest bid, I think, wins a lot of the time. And that winning advert is then served, at which point it loads. So that's what happened in the middle, half a second, between you clicking and you receiving that advert. And there's also opportunities often for a cookie sync with the winning advertiser. They can often do some cookie syncing to gain more tracking data at that point as a function, because they've had their ad actually load, and their ad could have loaded with other code as well. So this is the sort of structure of something called real-time bidding, and it's not the way that advertising on the web has always worked. It's worked this way since about 2011, 2012, and it's grown. So when people say this is inevitable, it's not actually that inevitable. Like, it's been a fairly recent development that we've had this kind of structure. And it's become quite advanced in the way it functions. So the bid request itself comes with lots of different information. So the URL being visited, the device, information about the user. Note, for example, that the category or topic of the website is a pretty interesting example here, because the categories include, from the Interactive Advertising Bureau, many information that could be health-related, for example, about those websites. And so they've tried to cleanse this recently after a complaint we made. But they still provide a URL, and there are plenty of services that will just categorize what URL you're visiting, so it's not really a very effective cleanse of this. The data is also retained. We find from regulatory efforts in France, not very many admittedly, that even going after a tiny ad tech company that is on the receiving end of some of these bids, you find that they have millions of bid requests that they just are keeping for a long time. And they are this company claims that privacy is at the heart of what they do, and not just that, they only retain 30% of their data and only for 12 months. So we're just seeing a fraction then, potentially in one of the better European-based companies that had their head above a parapet a little bit more, rather than the worst industry actors, I'd say. And we can see the scale of this, at least to some degree. This is some years ago now. This is back in 2018. But we don't know very much about the scale of this industry in absolute terms, because it's kept fairly secret. We know that there are many auction places which receive over 100 or 200 billion requests per day for these advertising requests. But we also know that Google is by far and away the dominant exchange in this, and we don't know how many they receive per day. But if we had to estimate, I would say several times more than this. We're looking at a much greater amount of dominance than Smatter, which is not very highly used, the mobile-based one. So we're talking really I wouldn't be surprised if it was well over 1 trillion or more. So we find here that we're talking about a huge amount of web history that is built, catalogued, and retained by companies around the world. An interesting sort of dimension of this is something called nano-targeting, which is that there's actually quite a lot of documentation that shows that you can use these commercial ad tools to target information at specific people. So you can even sell and say, I want my information to be targeted at this person who works in this function at CERN, and if you knew enough about them, like their interests or something about their IP address, you could make it so that they would see very particular adverts. And you can do it also within platforms on Facebook and so on. And there's lots of various war stories of this occurring, including for intimate partner abuse as well. And an interesting story about the former Labour Party leader in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, being targeted by his own party for these adverts to make it look like they were doing what he wanted them to do, when actually they thought another publicity campaign would be more effective for the party. So they would target sort of his political slogans at him, but so he would see them and then target more broadly to the world the slogans they wanted. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. It was reported on by a few outlets, but it sounds a little bit outlandish to me. But it's a fun anecdote. So just moving on to what we see as the legal domain of this. Many people associate, when they think of cookies in the law, they think of cookie banners and having to click through many different kinds of banners in order to achieve their desired outcome. So I want to note firstly one thing. I want to note that Privacy International on their webpage does not have a cookie banner, but they do lay cookies. Right. So how can this be? This is the world's most prominent privacy focused NGO. They're based in London, so they are actually this regime does apply to them, the same kind of regime as applies here. Actually, Swiss regime is slightly weaker in Switzerland than the UK and the EU, but usually gets treated the same. If we look at the law, we'll see why. So firstly, data protection applies to personal data, and personal data is defined as data or information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. So here we can see that essentially any information. So information is a very broad category. Any information, really broad. I mean, how much more broad can you get than a definition than any information? Relating to, the court has also decided this is a very broad definition. It says by content, meaning, or effect. So again, biographical or impact upon you. Again, very different, broad, wide way it can relate to you. Identified, you might think it might already have your name or ID number attached to it or email. But identifiable means really using reasonable means you could make this data identifiable. And we know that people have very unique traces through digital technologies, so the barrier for something to be identifiable is also quite low. And it has to be about a natural person. It's not about companies, and only in some countries is it about the dead. The dead are actually included in this regime, but only in some countries. So it's a very broad definition of personal data. And so things like cookies and cookie identifiers would come into this quite easily. Because they are often used, they render people identifiable, they relate to them and their devices and so on. Data protection law, like the GDPR, requires a lawful basis for all processing of personal data. Now, interestingly, this is not a consent-first law. People often think, when they think of data protection law, it's all about consent, we have to get consent from everything. It's just not true. When you read the law is designed for consent to sort of be a backstop. And the backstop is you're allowed to do it with consent if everything else fails. That's sort of the structure of the law in most situations. And if you're doing something that's aligned with the user, you're doing something the user would expect, the user would want, or there's a significant public interest in doing, then you very rarely need consent. Most people are using consent in data protection law, I would say, because they are too scared to make the judgment to say we're doing something aligned with the user. That might just be from being risk averse. But often it's because they're doing something that's actually against your interests, especially online. So things turn into consent as soon as you're doing something the user might not expect. And they can turn into consent as well when you use certain sensitive categories of data, like ethnicity or health. They might turn into consent. But broadly, if you're doing something that people are expecting and wanting, then you don't tend to need consent. So it's not a very prohibitive law. It's designed to be quite protective. It's just that we encounter in digital technology so many times people are trying to act against our interests that we find consent quite a lot. But it's also worth noting there's another law called the e-privacy directive, and that's around confidentiality of communications. And in that law, there is a specific part that says you do need consent if you are storing or receiving information for on terminal equipment, terminal devices, those are the devices at the edge of a network, if it's not necessary for the service a user has requested. So you think about cookies there. Well, you are storing a text file on my browser, and if it's necessary for what I've requested, like I needed to log in, I needed to buy something, I needed to remember my preferences, or so on, or even you need it for security purposes, really, like the website needs it to stay secure when you're browsing it, then you don't need a cookie banner. Don't need to get consent, because that stuff is needed. But when you say, I'm going to use it to do cross-site tracking of you, or analytics or so on, then you do need consent. And the history of that is not just from online tracking, but that law also comes from history of rootkits. So I don't know if anyone remembers trying to put, has anyone had the experience, and it was probably about 15, maybe more years ago now, where people would try and put a CD or a CD-ROM, maybe a music CD, in a computer, and it would be completely unnecessarily full of software for some reason. And sometimes that software was just malware, and sometimes it would really try and avoid your device copying or ripping the software. I see some nods in the room. Sometimes it was like some weird music video or some sort of side vanity project. But there was a small point in time, really, before that was triggering part of the reform of this law, where music publishers were saying, well, we're going to try and stop people breaking copyright by ripping CDs, or what they thought was breaking copyright at the time, by adding a rootkit to their device and effectively hacking their own equipment. So not great, but that would also be doing something like storing or retrieving data on your device unnecessary for the thing you've requested without consent. So it was also designed for this kind of thing. So it's quite a nice law in a way, because it's meant to give you a bit more sovereignty and control of what actually is happening to a device that you own, and stop kind of covert installations and things like that. And I promise not to look at this law too much, because you didn't really come here to look at law. But it's worth noting that consent in data protection law has a very high quality and standard in order to be valid. So not all things that look like data protection consent or request your consent are actually consent. Firstly, it has to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous, provided by a statement or a clear affirmative action. So it's not sort of scroll down and you've consented, don't press no when you've consented, that doesn't count. It has to be freely given, so it's difficult to bundle with other things. You can't really say, or there's a much higher barrier for saying at least, you get this service if you consent and you don't if you don't. Specific, so you can't be like, you consent to anything we want to do to generally improve our service, so that's something you see very often in these criteria. Informed is an odd one, because it's unclear whether they make an effort to inform you or you actually have to be successfully informed, and unambiguous. So pretty high barrier, and a few other points in the law that's worth noticing. Technically, the controller has to be able to demonstrate the consent has been given, which is so there's got to be some kind of logging or record keeping that is useful and holds the controller to account. And it should be as easy to withdraw as to give consent. So it should always be easy to say no as yes, and that should be the case even after you've given the consent. I'm going to just focus on those ones for now. And there's particularly in the recital to the law actually parts that say you can't just be pre-ticking boxes or giving silence. That does not count. They've been really, really specific in the reform of the law for this. So what we saw from online tracking is the attempt to kind of follow this law, which, by the way, is not new. Like this is not come in with 2016, 2018 with the GDPR. Like, this law has been applied long before that, and consent also had this same quality before that as well. So it's only when there was more public attention and higher fines and so on that people started to pay attention. But before that, they were also doing something illegal. So the reforms are sort of in reaction to enforcement more than they are in reaction to a strengthening of the substance of the law. When there are hundreds of trackers on a web page, like we've talked about, how do you even get consent to do this, or can you? Well, around 2016, we saw the emergence of something called the Consent Management Platform. And it's this kind of thing. You've probably seen these kind of things before. This is from SourceForge, and it's a consent management platform from a company called Quantcast. And I think you've all seen this kind of thing. It's sort of what you notice, I think, in the last few years is these look more uniform across web pages. Like, you'll see the same design patterns recurring again and again. And it's not always because it's some open source kit that people are reusing. There are vendors that sell this and promise to provide compliance solutions. And in doing so, they'll often have multiple pages, some with the purposes that this data is being used for or cookies are being laid for, and the different vendors in their word for trackers. So you've got lots of different companies that do this, and they all look a little bit different in the way they function. Some of them are deeply ridiculous. TrustArc is a particularly notably ridiculous one, because often when you try and say no to a TrustArc one, even if they let you, it will say, we're just saving your preferences, saving, and it'll take about 10 seconds. And if you dig into the code, it is just like a sleep. It's just like, sleep 10 seconds. It's not actually saving. It's just designed to make people add attrition. So you find lots of different things here. And they promise that people can be compliant with the law. So we did a study on this a few years ago in 2020, and with Aarhus University at MIT, and we looked at whether these could be legal. So we built a big web scraper and scraped about 100,000 pages after coding for 5 of the most popular consent management platforms to understand how they functioned. And so we found some data as a result of this. A few things to draw your attention to. So firstly, we looked at some simple legal tests to say, well, if you're not meeting these, you're definitely not meeting the law. Such as not pre-ticking any boxes that were optional, reject all being as easy as accepting all, and consent actually being explicit, not like a scroll down. An interesting thing with consent management platforms is that they can be configured in different ways. A web browser puts them on, a website puts them on, sorry, and they can actually make some choices which make them more or less compliant with the law. So they could say, we don't want a reject button. Like, don't put that on. And the consent management platform, their legal position is, well, we're just a tool. You can also buy a hammer and use it to hit someone's head in, but we wouldn't advise it. We're just a hammer producer. You can also use it to, construct a lifeboat. So this is the argument of the companies that sell this stuff. So we found only about 12% of these trackers that the consent management platforms, that we found, provided minimally valid consent when we look at the web pages. But I would even question this result that we got. I think it's even lower. Because when we look here at it gets more legally tenuous, so that's why we didn't sort of make this argument at this time, but nowadays we actually have more reason to make this argument. When you look at the different consent management platforms, we also looked at, say, the median number of trackers that you were consenting to at one time. So have a look at Quantcast. They're the most popular consent management platform in our database. Your median tracker is 542 trackers you're consenting to at once. And the average for the median for the whole data set we have is 315. So this is a single click. You're saying yes to, on average, about 300 trackers. This can't be informed consent. Like, you can't actually give consent as a mechanism to this many organizations at this time. It just does not function. But it is structurally the way that real-time bidding works, because you need to give consent to all potential auction participants. Otherwise, they can't participate in the auction because they can't process your data. Or at least that's the logic. So structurally, this whole thing doesn't function as an industry. We've done several things. We've made different complaints around this. There's been several regulatory investigations as a result of our complaints and research. It's led to some interesting decisions, particularly recently by the Belgian Data Protection Authority, where they've made, using our work quite heavily, they've drawn upon this analysis to try and point out the structural illegalities of this industry. This is all being appealed right now. There's a preliminary reference, which is sort of a question that's being asked to the European Court of Justice on this topic at the moment. So it's very live as a topic, but it's taken a long time to get this far because regulators have spent years and years and years not enforcing the law, and they've let it get to this state. They've let it get to a point where the entire industry is founded on illegality. Like, structure is founded on illegality. So imagine being a data protection regulator and having your door knocked on and said, could you just like cut the bottom out of this entire industry? Like, could you just swipe out and they all fall into a black hole? And the regulator sort of says, well, that sounds very bad for the economy. And you say, well, it's not really your job to consider the economy. It was maybe your job to consider, well, this didn't happen to begin with. But they're left between a rock and a hard place, or at least that's what they see. So that's kind of where we are with this sort of more contemporary form of online tracking. But things are changing. So I want to have a few words about the future of targeting. Firstly, some people in the room are probably familiar with a various array of privacy-enhancing technologies or privacy-enhancing computation. So you have technologies that are, they're not brand new, but they're definitely gaining in traction, such as multi-party computation or secure multi-party computation. The idea of this is that, say you all want to come together and compute some function, but you don't want anyone else to know the data you have. So if you're user A, you don't want B or C to know your piece of data, but you do actually want all together to get this function, which is a function of all your data together. Well, multi-party computation is a framework for doing this through a combination of encrypted communication, and out the middle pops this function at the end, and you can have mathematical assurances that nobody learned anything about A, B, and C except what could be learned from the output of this function. Neat. Doesn't really work when you have a million devices, because as you imagine, these lines don't scale like so well when you've got a million nodes connected by a million, million squared edges. So not great if you do that. So instead, people have other ways of doing it, like sort of having 3 servers that promise not to collude with each other, and individuals share secrets. They split their information in sort of 3 encrypted chunks. They give it to these servers promise not to collude, and they can compute this stuff together. So you have other technologies like this. There's also homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, and they're all sort of building blocks for more complex crypto systems that enable kind of neat functionality. And they say that they can do all this confidentiality without data objectively being shared. But companies now think, can we target users like before, but without our data leaving devices? Well, maybe what we can do, we could train shared models. We can train shared models with privacy-enhancing techniques like before, so that people can target themselves. On the phone, there's a model of what people like you with your kind of web history would like to see in an advert, or would like to click on an advert, or would actually click on an advert more than would like to. And we'll deliver the model locally. It's also possible because a range of more powerful hardware has allowed this to happen. And you could use technologies like zero-knowledge proofs to check if you've actually done it correctly, or you can use operating system restrictions, or you can say, well, you're not going to get your cloud service unless you prove to me you've been clicking on all these ads. So this is sort of the model in which companies and infrastructure providers are moving to say, we don't need to send this data to everywhere in the world. We can do this same kind of tracking more locally. One thing it sort of it asks for is who is doing this. So Google has proposed doing this in Chrome as part of Privacy Sandbox. Interestingly, this is being investigated by the UK Competition and Markets Authority, partially because they're saying, well, we're going to get rid of all third-party cookies from Chrome, and we're going to move to a privacy-friendly approach. And it's a bit cynical because Google has been the main beneficiary of this previous ad tech regime. And then they're saying, well, now we've got the infrastructure, we can cut out all these other ad tech companies that have been taking slices, and we can put it all in our system. And so you get the odd adversary here, which is Marketers for the Open Web. And it's a pressure group made of ad tech firms that say, please save the open web. And you're like, please help us, say, well, we don't have the infrastructure, please save our illegal business model from this evil giant. Like, well, I'm not sure that I really want to get in bed with you as a pressure group. The open web sounds very nice, but it's maybe not the kind of thing that I like you hanging around in. So this is a bit of turned into what some people frame as a privacy and competition dichotomy. But I think it's also because there's a lack of research in privacy-enhancing technologies that promote competition and plurality, that both don't require a single protocol designer to be in control of everything, can be negotiated a bit and more flexible, where there's more room for wiggle and squeeze and development and different trajectories, but which aren't a sort of open free-for-all where your data has to structurally go to thousands of places in order to deliver a service you didn't actually want. And there's other companies doing this, so Apple are hiring in ad tech quite a lot. Meta and Mozilla have proposed things at the IETF, which is mostly a response to things like Google and Apple, Meta and Mozilla saying we don't really have the infrastructure that these two organizations have, and we're going to lose out here. Like, no one has a Meta phone or a Meta browser, and therefore they feel pretty tenuous in this situation because they don't have the roots to deliver these protocols. So my last slide, just some questions for the future going from here. Firstly, is confidentiality enough? Like, if you say you're doing everything in your browser or on your device confidentially, well, is it okay if I target you using your heart rate or your skin conductivity? And I say, well, your heart rate seems high at the moment. Maybe you should, view this or watch this ad. Some people would say, well, it's all confidential. Like, what have you got to worry about? No one's seeing this data. So it goes back to the worries about intelligence agencies spying on things. But privacy is more than that. Privacy is not the same as confidentiality. Privacy is often about a boundary between you and your inner world and the outside world, and negotiating that boundary in a dynamic way, understanding your own identity and having a sort of safe space to do so while being able to let things in, keep things out, and change that negotiation over time. And certainly your device starting to change its behavior based on quite inner parts of your personality or biology seems to be a breach of privacy, even if there's not actually a person in a desk somewhere else who is able to see and look at what's going on there. And lastly, is your device betraying you? If you don't want your device to do this, like, you don't want your device to run this protocol, like, should you not be able to say, I don't want my device to run this protocol? A lot of cryptographic and privacy-enhanced technologists have not asked this question because they've made incorrect theoretical assumptions that their usual cryptographic characters of Alice and Bob and Eve, if you've ever read cryptography, all come together. But if they don't like the protocol, then Alice could just walk away. She doesn't have to take part in this protocol. The assumption is that she has the freedom to compute. But that is an assumption that's violated in today's world. We don't have the freedom to compute because we don't know what our devices are doing. And therefore, this fundamental, deeper assumption in cryptography and privacy-enhanced technologies is really broken. And we have to think about what rights we have, not just in relation to what your devices are doing, but what you're facilitating. Are you being part in some big collective computation or research experiment that you don't approve of? In which case, maybe you should have the right to withdraw your digital labor or your processing, given that we're all charging and caring for these devices. What rights come with that as well? And ad tech forces us to ask these questions as it develops into a confidential domain. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. We have purchased a beautiful, very well-tested closed captions automatic transcription tool. Today you were speaking so fast. I look forward to the results.
Oh, dear.
I don't know how it will be. So I have comments, questions. It's wonderful today, but please let's start with your questions, comments. The security officer of CERN is sitting there. We are honored, Stefan. And anybody who has any comments? Sebastian, security expert.
Hi, very, very interesting talk again. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And that perhaps was fast, but very clear, so no issues with that. I have a question on, you said that Android devices were, or Android and ecosystem was studied in terms of apps and how they track users and so on, and it's harder to study that for iOS devices, but they're not necessarily much better. That's what I understood. At the same time, there's this feature since fairly recently which says ask app not to track.
Yeah.
Like I can choose that. How good is that? What's your feeling about that one?
Yeah,
is it relevant here?
Yeah, I referred to it very briefly, but it's not great because all that feature does is at the operating system level, there is an identifier issued, and it says it's effectively an identifier that's about the vendor. If I remember, it's the vendor of an application. It's sort of a which you could have it shared across multiple applications. So if you have Google Maps and also Google installed, but also another app, that would all have the same identifier that's being given. Now, I think there might be a difference between what it sees per vendor of the app, but the do not track option is saying, don't give that identifier to the app. It's saying, don't let the app see the other apps I have installed. So it's a very limited restriction in many ways.
So it's really within the same vendor?
I believe it is within the same vendor, yeah, that one. And I think there's two identifiers. There's the ad ID and there's something called the Mobby ad ID. Mobby ad, maybe? Yeah. So it's a bit misleading because our setting up to track doesn't stop the app having embedded trackers that just call home and saying, you've clicked on this or you've got this high score or done any of this. So it's a bit of false sense of security, I'd say, that Apple is giving. And they got accused of reducing a lot of the market share, the share price of Facebook for a quarter or two, because Facebook had relied fairly heavily on this ad ID for some retargeting. But beyond that, I think it's not an effective approach. So I think that's partially why the Apple system is not much better. But there's a great paper from colleagues at the University of Amsterdam called Smartphones as Privacy Regulators. Smartphone ecosystems as privacy regulators, I think it's called. It's by Joris van Hoboken and Ronan Fahy. It came out a couple of years ago. And it's a very nice role about the role that app stores have and are playing in privacy regulation assurance. But it's got a way to go yet because there's no setting that you can use on an iPhone just to turn off tracking. And I run all my phone traffic through a Pi-hole, which is a sort of a DNS system you can set up and you can access it over your own VPN, and it will try and block known DNS calls to known trackers, and that does something to help you with apps, but that's not possible at a level on the phone. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. You didn't mention DNS over HTTP, which is also exposing lots of privacy information to companies, and for security, with some of us in, this poses enormous problems because we're losing traceability, and then we cannot protect our constituencies anymore because today I can see that you browsed maliciousdomain.com. In the future, Google sees that you browsed maliciousdomain.com, and they will then just sell you some ads. But that's not my question. Ad blockers. You didn't mention too much ad blockers. The question I got is some of us are deploying lots and lots of different ad blockers just to avoid that cookies are installed, that I'm traced, and so on. So legally, if I'm running a plethora of ad blockers to show the other side that I do not want having ads and being tracked and so on, I see it more and more often that web pages then try to circumvent my ad blockers. My question is, legally, how far is this already a way into trespassing? Because I make clear by sign that this is a no-go area for those companies, and they still try to break my defenses or my fences to get into my device.
Yeah.
In the physical world, I would consider this to be trespassing, which is illegal. In the digital world, can I sue somebody?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the US is a much better, not better regime, but a much more favorable regime to comparing trespass with digital intrusions. But you also, it's got some problems as well. On the other hand, in the US, companies have tried to use trespass the other way around, to say, you can't scrape my website for academic research because our terms of service says you can't do it. And therefore it's trespass. So a series of cases like HiQ and LinkedIn, and a case that's been brought by Christian Sandvig at University of Michigan and Kari Karahalios at University of Illinois in the US, was about this and trying to show that that's not actually allowed. So when you say that trespass trespass sounds like a good way to do it, but what you end up doing is really allowing individuals to set very detailed parameters on who can access their website and not and for what purposes, and that can really stop accountability too. So other jurisdictions have not gone down that route so much. The reason why it's difficult in the US is because trespass can become a criminal offense. So it's effectively meant that companies want their terms of service to trigger criminal offenses against individuals, which is kind of bonkers. But more relevant in a European context, but also increasingly in a US context, is that is the link between tracking law and do not track signals. So Do Not Track was a initiative, well, it's been many years in the making of different iterations where effectively your browser is supposed to send out a signal, and that signal is meant to be recognized and potentially either voluntarily adhered to or may have legal effect upon those that hear it. And it could be an HTML header or something else. This failed the first time because it didn't really have legal backing, but also because companies just refused to agree on what a definition of tracking was. Now, in the GDPR, there is a right to object by automated means. That hasn't been fully explored, but you might want to ask that later in the week because NOIB are building a signal, a do not track signal. NOIB is the speaker for the next couple of days on Zoom, is doing that, so they may be able to tell you more about that. There's also work in California called Global Privacy Control. So Californian data protection law has a more advanced do not track system that can be written in by standards, and different US states are also exploring this. So there may be standards which are sort of agreed upon that if you do receive the standard, it is the same as a legally binding request to say no. And that should also lead to overrides for consent boxes. Say, if you see this, do not show me a consent box, for example. So that is also part of the mix. So we're seeing that as an emerging part of law. In Europe, it has been stalled because the parts of the law that would deal with do not track are tied up with national security issues in the legislative process. So the reform of the e-privacy directive would be called the e-privacy regulation. And the problem with that is the Court of Justice has used the e-privacy regulation and some of its provisions to try and stop member states retaining large amounts of telecoms data just for the sake of it for many, many months for no real reason. So like France and the UK and so on constantly do this and retain huge amounts of data. And it led to the striking down of something called the Data Retention Directive on the basis that it was disproportionate and against European fundamental rights. That's tangled up with the e-privacy regulation. So member states find this topic incredibly sensitive because they want to do more and more surveillance. And yet the regulation that would have maybe attractive do not track provisions that would make those more legally binding and more clear can't get passed because it's sort of stuck in a logjam about this. So that's a bit of a challenge that is currently there. But certainly, people point to do not track as a way forward, but it would require the cooperation of operating systems and also an effective way to police it. So if you don't really have meaningful enforcement to check people are really obeying this signal, like we don't at the moment, then yes, you could say they're doing something illegal, but as I pointed out, these companies have been doing lots of illegal things and have got away with it. So maybe ignoring do not track would just be one more illegal thing they'd get away with until enforcement is sorted out.
Thank you again. About what Stefan just said and the explanation you give, isn't it true that eventually, for these last questions on your last slide, today's options to really be sheltered from tracking is to get off the grid, to use the buzzword, for people who are not capable of hacking their devices, configuring them securely behind the VPN and all that stuff. Because the reason why since 2016, for example, as we discussed briefly also yesterday, the Tim Berners-Lee project Solid did not take off for so many years is because people don't have enough expertise to run their Solid pods themselves and only with trusted other web servers exchange. Because you say in the US the legislation is sort of advanced. On the other hand, in the US you have the GAFAMs of this world who do most expert tracing. Yeah. And you have the COVID period or any other invented crisis period where under security or public health excuses people are traced and tracked scrupulously. Yeah. So can we do any? I mean, Edward Snowden, what he leaked for NSA seems like peanuts today with what's going on. Nobody was moved by the fact that they were unveiled.
Yeah, there's no really convenient way to prevent tracking, and certainly not for people who are not so technologically savvy. There are some default moves, so blocking third-party cookies and so on. Increasingly, like if you use things like Safari, it is quite difficult to do tracking. Companies often just write off Safari browser users. So there are like a range of defaults that are emerging that are a little bit better in some areas, but there are also big gray areas where they're not very effective. And as I say, it's a constant battle and arms race. And I think a challenge is the reason I sort of do the future part is that we're looking a little bit backwards. Like the age of cookies is on the way out. Like the age of some, maybe app tracking might take a bit longer, I think. But things like cookies are on the way out slowly as defaults in browsers change. But they're on the way out as these are pivoting to a new form of targeting. And for those who came to yesterday's talk, I talked a bit about platforms and access and legibility as being the motives rather than collecting a lot of data. And if you think about that through local targeting, it's the same thing. They found ways to make people legible, but on their devices. They found ways to sell access to people, so sell advertisers so that they can give adverts to people on their devices, but have them delivered locally. And have them accounted for and then billed centrally with privacy-enhancing or privacy-preserving technologies. And so I think this is the sort of next level where we had to think about maybe less about data disclosure, but more about manipulation, shaping of worlds, dividing of people up into groups, and focus really on the functionality. Because at the moment we'll be focusing on the side effects have been so bad with the existing tracking systems. For no reason at all, like hundreds of companies have huge copies of your web browsing history, which can and are weaponized by states. And also those companies in lots of other areas, and insurers and various other things. So that's then, still now, but it's also on the way out, those harms, because now we're moving towards being able to grapple, I think, with the primary functionality rather than just the side effects. But it's a shame that regulation and law didn't really help us in that way. We've sort of basically waited until platforms found a way to be powerful enough in the new world where they could do the functionality they wanted to do without the side effects. And so they've helped us regulate our way out of this space. Apple have said, well, in Safari and in iOS, we'll put in things that limit certain kinds of tracking. Even Google have said this in Chrome. The reason they're doing this is not because they've caught up and their morality has sort of reached them. It's because they see a pivot to functionality without these side effects, and of course they're going to take it because the side effects are the easiest thing for regulators to point their fingers to and say, we don't want any of this data leakage. Data leakage is a very easy thing comparatively to regulate because you can knock on someone's door and say you're responsible for this data leakage. It's very difficult to stop, right? But it's very easy to when you have a leak, the point is you can find the source of a leak and try and plug the leak. That's very different than kind of going to functionality and saying we want to regulate the direction of this deep inbuilt distributed functionality that we think is problematic, because you suddenly walk yourself to an infrastructure and you say, I want these water pipes to work differently. I want them to deliver things to different locations. I want internet to be more evenly distributed. I want coverage of broadband to be easily distributed. I want adverts to be sort of fairer and so on. And we find a lot of discriminatory adverts as well. So we find that job ads are going more to men than women, or more to people of different ethnicities. And actually that becomes very difficult to regulate in an encrypted ecosystem as well. So you find other ways in which it's going to become trickier and trickier to have oversight, let alone political ads, which are their own area of difficulty, let alone the hardest thing to regulate, which is political ads in small countries who, if you think of a small island state, which does not have a cybersecurity group or core or a CERT even sometimes, and people are buying political ads from rich countries outside to influence those elections. Those countries can't even pick up the phone to these platforms. They don't even pick up. So we find all of these levels which become harder and harder as things go on device and more arcane, harder to deal with. So I think that's where we're going to head. So yes, our confidentiality may be getting better, finally, but not for reasons we should really be celebrating.
Just to be clear, you're basically saying, okay, we have kind of tried to deal with... Just to be clear, you've basically said we have dealt, we have mostly dealt with the side effects of tracking, but the actual consequences of the tracking are the things that are going to be scary as well.
Yeah, well, we haven't really dealt with them. It's think of that like the fox in the hen coop. You know, the fox has now decided to deal with the hens not being in the coop by effectively like going home but having a hen delivery company. Instead, or like having a meal delivery company, I give the hens food. They don't need to. The hens can go free now because the fox has found another way to eat hens. This is effectively what's happened. Like the regulation that is the most effective of privacy is being done by the organizations that largely have been the biggest beneficiaries of these side effects, which sort of shows how far behind we are. And yes, we still have to finish the regulation of the side effects, but it's why the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK is getting so confused, because they are saying, well, Google is saying we want to get rid of cookies, so maybe we should stop that for anti-competitive reasons, but that would also need to be better for privacy, so we're very confused about what to do here. It seems to both be a good thing and a bad thing. And the answer is yes, it is both a good thing and a bad thing, because this organization is just in charge of its own trajectory. And unless somebody steps up and says, here is an alternative design for the future, and we need to push towards this alternative design, which is not being pushed either by the incumbent data leakage ad tech actors or by the big platforms that are steering the infrastructure, we're not going to get anywhere so useful. So it's a bit of a shame, but yeah.
Yeah, similar to what you've been saying in yesterday's talk, it's basically these large platforms being able to shape how, the future of tracking looks like instead of us, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a broken record in that way. Cool.
So everybody, thank you so much for staying, and thanks so much to the speaker for the enthusiasm and eagerness to answer. I suggest we go next door to eat something if you want to continue this discussion, so that because soon there will be time for the airport for you. So why don't we continue in restaurant 2? Just we queue and get the food as usual. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.